The storm rolled in quiet as a held breath, moving low across the prairie like a great dark animal searching for a place to rest. Maeve Alder stood outside her cabin, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, stacking the last of the firewood before the sky opened. At her age, every motion had the weight of memory. Her bones ached not from the cold, but from all the winters she had survived alone. The wind teased her gray hair loose, carrying a taste of rain and something else she couldn't name. An omen, perhaps. She whispered to herself the way lonely people do. Winter always takes more than it gives. A shadow moved at the edge of her land. At first she thought it was a stray mule or one of the rancher's dogs wandering off. But the shape limped, slow, dragging one foot behind the other. The storm grumbled overhead as the figure came closer, leaning heavily on a stick that looked ready to snap. By the time he reached her porch, the first cold drops had begun to fall. He stood in the doorway as though the last of his strength was used simply to remain upright. A tall man, broad-shouldered beneath a soaked coat, hair tangled with sleet. His face was worn, carved with years of wind, wilderness, and silence. He looked like he had come out of the mountains themselves. "Ma'am," his voice cracked. "I'm sick, can't walk anymore. Can I stay just one night?" Maeve's first instinct was fear. A lone woman didn't survive the frontier by inviting strangers in. She studied him carefully, ready to see danger in his eyes. But what she found instead was a raw, pleading shame. A man who hated asking for help, maybe more than the sickness itself. She stepped aside with a stiff nod. One night, he staggered in, nearly collapsing as the door shut behind him. Maeve lit the hearth with trembling hands. The fire caught slowly, sending soft warmth into the cold, dim room. The air filled with the familiar scent of sage she hung from the beams. The stranger, Elias Crow, he later said, lowered himself to the floor near the fire with a grunt that sounded like pain. Maeve noticed how his hands shook uncontrollably, how his boots were torn from long miles, how fever glistened on his forehead. "You're burning up," she murmured. "Just the cold," he muttered, though his voice betrayed him. "I won't trouble you long." Maeve kept her back straight, her tone cool. "A night's warmth is all I have offered." He dipped his head, ashamed. "A night's more than most would give." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of the things neither wanted to say. Maeve remembered the years when her late husband drank away their money, when the townspeople whispered behind her back. She had learned to expect judgment before mercy. Elias, she suspected, had expected the same. He watched her build the fire, eyes heavy with exhaustion. "I was a trapper," he said after a long, quiet minute. "Lived in the mountains mostly. Haven't spoken to a soul in weeks." Maeve didn't answer at first. She busied herself with a kettle, with the ritual of tending to someone she wasn't sure she wanted to care for. "I used to tend to strangers," she finally whispered. "Long time ago." Elias shifted, wincing. "I don't mean to be a burden." "Burden is a word men use too easily," she replied, more sharply than she intended. Before anything else could be said, a horse snorted outside. Maeve stiffened. Only one man rode out this far, just to check on her. Deputy Jeb Ryder knocked, loud enough that something inside Maeve flinched. She opened the door a crack. "Evening, Maeve," Jeb said, eyes narrowing past her to the stranger by the fire. "Everything all right? Heard someone came limping this way." Maeve tried to keep her voice steady. "He's sick. Needed a place to rest." Jeb leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You know how folks talk. You being alone, and all, letting in a man no one knows." Behind her, Elias pushed himself up on one elbow, tried to look less helpless than he was. "I'll leave," he rasped, even though he could barely lift his head. Maeve's jaw tightened. "The town has talked about me for years, Deputy. Let them tire themselves out." Jeb hesitated, taken aback by the steel in her voice, but finally tipped his hat and rode off. The moment he was gone, Elias tried to stand again, tried and immediately failed, his legs folding beneath him. Maeve caught him by instinct, her hands gripping his arms. The contact startled them both. "You shouldn't move," she said, breath uneven. "I don't want to bring you trouble," he whispered, humiliation thick in his voice. "You already tried to leave twice," she replied softly. If trouble was to come, it would have come anyway. He sank back down, defeated. Night deepened around the cabin. Rain drummed softly on the roof like a heartbeat. Elias's fever worsened, making him tremble under the wool blanket she draped over him. Maeve brewed herbs, mint, willow bark, a pinch of wild yarrow, and pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. "You don't owe me this," he murmured, eyes half closed. Maeve paused. Her hands hovered above him, uncertain. "Maybe I do. Once, someone turned me away in a storm just like this." Elias opened his eyes, slow, searching, but she didn't explain more. Some stories are too personal to give to a man you've known for only an hour. Still, something shifted in the cabin, a quiet thread of understanding weaving itself between them. By dawn, the storm had pulled back into the mountains. Pale gold light streamed through the small window, laying gentle warmth across the floor. Elias blinked awake and saw his boots, cleaned and set neatly by the hearth. His coat hung over a chair, no longer dripping. Maeve busied herself at the stove as though she hadn't done any of it. He sat up slowly, feeling smaller than he was. "You cleaned my things." "It was either that or let the mud make itself at home," she said without looking at him. He tried to smile, but guilt shadowed his eyes. "Thank you." Maeve placed a plate of eggs and cornbread on the table, her movements quick and quiet. "Eat. Fever burns strength quicker than cold." He obeyed, though every bite seemed to humble him further. The room was peaceful, the kind of peace that comes only after storms. Weathered, fragile, beautiful. "Maeve," he said after a long silence, "I'll be going soon. Soon as my legs let me." She raised an eyebrow. "You couldn't walk to the door last night without falling." "I'll crawl if I have to." "You will do no such thing," she replied. "You'll stay until you can stand without trembling." He swallowed hard. No one had spoken to him like that in years. Not since his brother died in the mountains, leaving him with a guilt too heavy to share. Elias pushed the blanket aside and attempted to rise, perhaps to prove something. His legs buckled immediately. Maeve moved without thinking, stepping forward to support him. Her hands settled on his arms again, steady, warm, unafraid this time. He stared at her, caught between shame and gratitude. "I didn't mean to fall at your door," he whispered. "I don't think people choose where they fall," she said softly. "But we choose whether we leave them lying there." Outside, faint voices drifted, townsfolk already gossiping after Jeb's visit. Maeve heard them. She knew the sting of their words even before they were spoken. She walked to the door and closed it firmly, shutting out the whispers for the first time in many years. Inside the cabin, something fragile but profound took root in the silence that followed. A beginning neither of them had expected, yet both desperately needed. Days passed like pages, turning in a book neither of them had meant to start reading together. Each dawn brought a fragile light that rested on Elias Crow's face, showing whether his fever had loosened its grip. Some mornings he woke clearer, others trembling so badly Maeve Alder had to guide his hands just to drink water. Pride fought him every step, but sickness had its own rules, and he could no longer pretend he wasn't broken. He tried to help where he could. Once, he insisted on carrying a bucket of water in from the well. Maeve found him slumped halfway across the yard, sweat pouring down his face though the air was cold enough to bite. She knelt, taking the bucket gently from his hands. "You'll tear yourself apart," she murmured. "I'm no use to you lying here," he muttered. "You're not here to be useful," she replied. "You're here to heal." But Elias had forgotten how to let anyone care for him. Still, small gestures grew in the quiet. Maeve found her broken chair, fixed one morning, its leg carefully sanded and mended. When she asked, Elias only shrugged, looking away as though embarrassed by his own kindness. In return, she left blankets folded near where he slept, made broth on nights the fever climbed high, brushed snow away from the steps before he woke. Each act was subtle, almost shy. Their bond moved like winter rivers, slow beneath ice, but undeniably there. Yet outside their cabin, the world was less gentle. Clara Finch from the general store made a point of riding out to check on the widow. She stood with her hands on her hips, sharp eyes scanning Elias, as though he were some threat she could pin with a finger. "Maeve, you don't know who he is," Clara warned. Mountain folk live hard. He could be dangerous. Or worthless. Elias heard every word. Shame colored his cheeks. He reached for his pack that very night. "I'll leave tomorrow," he said. Maeve didn't answer. She only stirred the fire, eyes fixed on the rising sparks. Her silence hurt more than any refusal. The next morning, as snow dusted the plains in thin white sheets, Elias sat by the hearth and finally spoke the truth weighed on him since the night he arrived. "I lost my brother," he said quietly. 3 winters ago. Storm caught us on Ironback Ridge. I told her we could push through. His voice wavered. He listened to me. Shouldn't have. Maeve set down the kettle. Something in her chest cracked open. "My husband drank himself into the grave," she replied. Town felt sorry for him, but they pitied me more. A weak woman who couldn't save him. Her hands trembled. I learned to live with other people's judgments. They never learned to live with their own. A long silence stretched, soft as breath, heavy as grief. The narrator inside Maeve, the old soul who watched life from a distance, felt something shift between them. Some wounds do recognize each other, but healing rarely arrives quietly. On the 4th morning, the crunch of boots outside shattered their fragile peace. Deputy Jeb Ryder appeared again, his coat dusted with frost, his jaw set hard. "Morning, Maeve," he said, though his eyes were fixed on Elias. Towns decided. Stranger needs to be gone by sundown. Maeve froze. Elias closed his eyes, as if the words were expected but still cut deep. "Jeb," Maeve said slowly, "he's sick. Too sick to walk to the next house, let alone out of town." "That's not my problem," the deputy replied. "But keeping him here could become yours." Elias rose shakily. "It's fine. I'll go." Maeve's heart dropped. She saw him pack his few things, hands trembling, breath short, pride wrapped around his body like armor. She watched him try to tie his bedroll and fail, fingers slipping repeatedly. By late afternoon, he stepped out into the cold, leaning heavily on a makeshift walking stick. Maeve stood in the doorway, unable to speak. He offered her a small nod, a farewell between two people who had shared more in a handful of days than many do in a lifetime. She turned away before her eyes could give her away. But he didn't get far. Barely 10 yards from the cabin, Elias stumbled, then collapsed outright, face first in the snow. Jeb Ryder was there instantly, calling out to the gathering townsfolk who had come to witness the spectacle. Maeve moved without thinking, racing toward Elias. She threw herself to her knees beside him, her skirts soaking in the snow. When Jeb reached for Elias's arm, Maeve slapped his hand away. "You leave him," she said, her voice trembling with fear and fury. "Maeve, a sick man is not a threat," she said louder. "But your fear is." The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, listening. Maeve gathered Elias in her arms, his head lolling weakly against her shoulder. His eyes fluttered, unfocused. "I'm sorry," he murmured. No, you're not leaving like this." Her voice cracked. "Not while I'm still breathing." The townsfolk watched her, this quiet widow who had never raised her voice, never stood her ground, now shielding a stranger as if he were family. Something changed in that moment. Maybe in her, maybe in them. She guided Elias back to the cabin, step by agonizing step, her arm around his waist, his weight heavy and failing. Once inside, she laid him on the bed that once belonged to her late husband, something she had never allowed anyone else to touch. The fever came hard that night, harder than before. Elias thrashed weakly, murmuring names, apologies, bits of memories that spilled out like broken glass. Maeve stayed beside him, wiping his brow, whispering soft prayers she thought she'd forgotten. "You stay with me," she whispered. "Hear me? You stay." Elias's cracked voice emerged through the haze. "No one's ever stayed for me." Maeve brushed his hair back gently. "Then let me be the first." Hours passed. The fire dimmed, flare dimmed again. Snow piled outside, sealing them off from the world. Maeve held his hand through the worst of it, listening to his ragged breathing like it was a fragile song she refused to let end. When dawn finally broke, soft and silver, Elias's fever had broken with it. He opened his eyes, clearer, brighter, alive. Maeve let out a breath she had held for hours, maybe days. By midday, he insisted on standing. She tried to stop him, but he rose anyway, legs trembling, determination burning in his face. He stepped outside, leaning heavily on the doorframe. The townsfolk, curious and conflicted, watched from afar. Elias turned to them, his voice carrying over the cold air. "I owe this woman my life," he said, "and I won't pretend otherwise." Maeve felt heat rise in her chest, a quiet, powerful pride she hadn't felt in years. He looked at her then, really looked, as though seeing the shape of his future in the lines time had carved into her face. For the first time, the town looked at Maeve Alder not as a widow or a pitiful woman, but as someone with a fierce, unshakable grace. Later, when the sun dipped low and the sky blushed with rose and honey, Elias packed his things again. Not because he was forced to, but because he believed it was right. He stopped at the doorway, hat in hand. "When spring comes," he said softly, "may I come back?" Maeve felt her heartbeat echo through her ribs. She nodded. Only once, but it was enough to change the course of 2 lives. He smiled the smallest, most grateful smile she had ever seen, then stepped into the fading light. Maeve watched until he disappeared over the ridge. She stayed in the doorway long after, hand pressed to her chest, feeling something new blooming there, a seed of hope that winter hadn't managed to kill. And then the story shifts, breaking from the world of the cabin and turning softly toward the listener. If life has ever left you stranded at someone's doorstep, sick, ashamed, trembling, remember this: a single act of mercy can change the ending of a long, hard story. And if ever you are the one standing at the door, deciding whether to open it, let your heart become the shelter you once needed. Grace is like firelight. It grows brighter every time we share it.